Okay, so I don't want to be too controversial, although this probably will end up being that way since I'm trying to be objective historically here. Uh, I'm not also going to cover things too far in the present either, or too close to the present. So I probably will be completely finished as far as the timeline here by 1996. So, uh, 1996 still far away from the events of today and even of 2014. I'm also not going to concentrate a lot on the earlier period um, in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. But I do want to note that the initial probably development will be considered modern Ukrainian nationalism. Can be traced back probably in some sense to the 1648 uprising under Kamensky. And that uprising is not against the Russians. Right? So while later on, particularly after 1945 and the UN, particularly the OUN-B under Yaroslav Stetsko, Bandera himself is assassinated by the KGB in 1959, become increasingly anti-Russian, not just anti-Soviet. But the initial, as it were, Ukrainian uprising against foreign rule was against Poland. So the Polish were the first enemy, and this will continue with the UN coming out of the Ukrainian military organization in the 1920s and 1930s into the 1940s, particularly the Volhynian massacres in 1943. So that I want to get there. Now, regarding the role of Jews in Ukrainian nationalism, I think it's fair to say that while a lot of what they wrote was self-serving, that their claim by the OUN-B, Organization Ukrainian Nationalist Bandera faction, that Jews were a secondary enemy compared to Russians or Poles is correct. So, in the Kamensky uprising already 1648, there is a lot of violence against Jews, but they are Jews who are working for the Polish nobles. So they are viewed as middleman enforcers. Same thing can be said about the Jews in the Cheka in Kiev during the Civil War, or their dominance in the OGPU and NKVD, particularly when Genrikh Yagoda was de facto head of the OGPU during the Holodomor, although de jure number two man under Męczynski, who was Polish, ironically, and also the head of the Ukrainian Communist Party. Stanislav Kosher was also ethnically Polish, so even on the Soviet side, there are Poles that are collaborating with the Soviet regime to repress Ukrainians. Of course, Kaganovich, Yagoda, Israel Laplevsky a little later, head of the NKVD for Ukraine. Number two man is Lev Reichman. All right, but these are obviously not the top roles. The Soviet government, as far as sheer numbers, because they are a majority in the Soviet Union, composed mostly of ethnic Russian. But the person at the very top, Joseph Stalin, Georgian, certainly not Russian, and Beria is head of political police after Yezhov is removed, also Georgian, and of course Kaganovich is Jewish, There's also in the Soviet Politburo under Stalin, Mikoyan, who is Armenian. So there's definitely it still remains a multi-ethnic and multi-national regime under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, who will die in 5th of March, 1953. All right, so Ukrainian nationalism in the 19th century, when most European nationalisms and some nationalisms outside of Europe start to develop, it develops largely in the area of Ukraine ruled by Austria and Galicia, where they have much greater freedom to engage in educational and propaganda activities than they do in the Russian Empire to the east. And this will continue to be true after World War I, when both the Austro-Hungarian and Russian empires collapse, and you have Ukraine split between the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in the east. The USSR is formally founded in December 1922, and the Polish Republic in the west. And 1919, they pretty much take control over the western part of Ukraine, but it's not formally annexed and integrated into the Polish state until 1923. So at the same time that the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic becomes a founding republic of the USSR at the end of 1922. So there is initially the Ukrainian military organization under that formed, and this will later become the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists in 1929. It's founded outside of any Ukrainian territory, founded in Vienna and what is left of Austria after the First World War. And it is basically a nationalist terrorist in the sense that they use assassinations and other asymmetrical warfare as their main means of deed. Propaganda of the deed, as the anarchists would have earlier said, but operating very much the way many Palestinian groups would later operate, that is, assassination of local officials, assassination of Polish colonists, many of them who had fought against Soviet Russia in the Polish-Soviet War and got land in Ukrainian areas to settle, the so-called osadniki. Attempts, of course, on higher officials as well, not as successful. But they do go after, with a vengeance, those Polish officials that want a reconciliation and peaceful solution to, I guess, the Ukrainian question. So the UN is very uncompromising from the very beginning, even before Bandera takes control of it, or the main faction of it, after 1940. The integral nationalists, that is, they put the nation above everything else. And interestingly enough, they are able to create an ideology that is exclusive of everybody who is not Ukrainian. They exclude particularly Poles and Russians, also Jews. Not sure if they ever had anything specific on Germans. A large German minority was living in Polish Volhynia up until 1940, over 50,000 still. But probably would not have been allowed to live in an UN-dominated state. It would have to be entirely Ukrainian by ancestry. There's no Germans, no Jews, no Russians, no Crimean Tatars, no Greeks, or any of the other ethnic minorities that had started settling in Ukraine already. We're counting the Crimean Tatars. Well, no, if we count the Greeks already in ancient times. So there's no room for them. But they never had, interestingly enough, and this is where like modern scholars just can't wrap their brains around things. They never had any sophisticated racial ideology based upon biology or genetics, right? It's just that we know this person is Ukrainian. He speaks Ukrainian. His ancestors spoke Ukrainian. We know this person is Russian, right? And therefore the Russian is completely and totally different, even though genetically and biologically they're exactly the same. And so the Russian has to be killed. All right. The basis of racism in the West does not come from biology, does not come from genetics. It's been very well explained by people like Malik, whom I used as my main textbook to teach race and ethnicity in Ghana. A liberal ideology to explain inequalities and policies of inequality like slavery, when you're stealing people's labor, after the development of the Enlightenment and liberalism and the French Revolution. Right? So if everybody's to be equal and have certain rights after the monarch is deposed, does that include the slaves in Haiti? And so as a way of squaring the circle, racism was always a liberal ideological project. And you see the biggest racists are people like Woodrow Wilson. And I would say today, there's no ideological difference between Biden and Greenblatt and Spencer and Johnson on this. They're all just part of this liberal project. And even in South Africa, apartheid. The reason for apartheid was to redistribute black resources to poor Afrikaners and eliminate the problem of white poverty. That's not a reactionary project, because reactionaries always said there is no equality. We don't need any justification for inequality. We don't have to have a sophisticated biological genetic theory that says, well, all us French people or all us German people or all us white people are equal, but those people with dark skin, no, they're not, so we can take their stuff. All right? That's a liberal idea. That's not a reactionary idea. Reactionary would say there's no equality. It doesn't even matter if your skin color is the same, right? Some people are born smarter. Some people are born less smart. Some people are born with positions, other people not. But you don't need an ideology to justify inequality from the pre-French Revolutionary, pre-Enlightenment era. So racism is entirely in a development in that sense, a liberal project to stress national equality or racial equality among whites. But equality is a liberal and leftist idea. All right, so nonetheless, the UN didn't even need any scientific justification, unlike the 19th century. Right, we're talking about a system of racial ideology that is based upon largely culture, rather as a signifier rather than genetics or biology, because there's no difference between a Russian and a Ukrainian when you try and look at DNA. All right. So the UN is heavily influenced from early on by particularly the fascists in Italy as far as organizing. They call themselves integral nationalists. This is putting the nation at the very highest. And in some sense, because it's just Ukrainian nationalism, it's much more narrow. And for instance, the idea of Aryanism, which would include most white Europeans, right? So Ukrainians do not consider Russians or Poles to be people worthy of life in terms of the OUN-B ideology. So The UN hasn't split yet. It's still under Menelik before 1940 during this period of time when they're largely engaged in terrorist activities aimed at the Polish state, uh, including obviously Polish civilian settlers as well as the former military settlers, the osadniki. Uh, and this brings them to, of course, conflict with Poland, which is nothing new. We go back to Komensky. Ukrainian nationalism develops first in opposition to Poland, not to Russia. In the eastern part of Ukraine, during a period of time of 1923 to 1941, with the beginning of the German invasion, you do not see this type of asymmetrical warfare organized by Ukrainian nationalist organizations in the Soviet East. They are largely crushed as a population by the 1932-33 Holodomor coming on the heels of dekulakization and forced collectivization of agriculture. All right, so just as Ukrainian nationalism developed in Austrian-ruled Galicia, which comes under Polish rule, rather than Tsarist Russia so much because of the much more lenient policies of the Austrians, the more liberal policies of the Polish state allow for the development of a Ukrainian nationalist underground that does not develop anywhere near to that extent in the Soviet-controlled areas of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And any that had certainly would have been almost completely wiped out by 37, 38. It was a great terror under Israel Laplevsky and Lev Reichman in Ukraine. Although of the 70,000 plus people shot in Ukraine during these 2 years, a very large number are ethnically Polish operation, and a very large number are ethnically German. The German operation, over 18,000 executions in Ukraine alone during these 2 years. When the German and Soviet governments signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939, the 23rd of August, the part of Poland that is predominantly inhabited by ethnic Ukrainians in the southeast comes under Soviet rule. And the Soviets justify this in large part as unifying historical Ukrainian lands, and they forcibly deport to the east a large number of ethnic Poles, particularly the Osadniki. Over 140,000 Osadniki are deported out of 400,000 former Polish citizens. Now, there is only one of the 4 waves of mass deportations from what was eastern Poland that targets Ukrainians. It's about 15,000 of them at the 3rd wave, I believe. So the first wave is mostly ethnic Poles. The second wave, I believe, mostly Jewish refugees. Third wave, Ukrainians, and then the fourth wave, Poles again. But most of the people being deported as special settlers into Siberia and other eastern areas of the USSR from what was eastern Poland in 1940 are ethnically Polish. Ukrainian, despite being a majority of the territory annexed to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, only a small portion of the deportees. And again, it's done in the name of Ukrainian unification. Ukrainian language is re-legalized in all the institutions in Western Ukraine. We have this bizarre kind of Soviet Ukrainian nationalism, which was quite popular in the Communist Party in Ukraine, particularly up until um, the 1930s. So in the 1920s, during Korenizatsiya, Ukrainianization, the idea of Ukrainian communist state being constructed in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic has a number of advocates in the uh, government of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. In 1940, the UN splits. Milnik was the former leader. The UN-M, this is the more moderate faction, and then Stepan Bandera, who's been involved in underground work, the UN-B. The UN-B will, during the war, concentrate its efforts in Western Ukraine, where it still was based part in Poland. What had been part of Poland from at least 1923, 1919, if you want to be about effective rule, all the way up until 1940. The UN-M manages to spread its influence considerably further east into areas that were part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic during the German occupation. They're also, partially as a result of this, much more moderate, but they lose out to the UN-B. Organizationally, is surviving past the Second World War. There is a declaration of an independent Ukrainian state in Lviv by Yaroslav Stetsko, whose name will come up again and again. When the Germans come in, Stetsko, Bandera, and the people around him in this government are arrested and sent to concentration camps until 1944. Now, a lot of people view this kind of mistake by the Germans. Oh, you alienated possible Ukrainian allies. You know, if you just followed Alfred Rosenberg, you could ally with Ukrainians, put a big Ukrainian army of 10 million people, go fight and take over Moscow. But given the UN's extremist ideology, you know, it was probable that the UN would have gone after the ethnic Germans in Ukraine. So the 50,000 in Polish Volhynia are evacuated by the German government to the Wartagau already in 1940. And most of the 300,000 Germans in eastern Ukraine who are not deported into Kazakhstan by the Soviets during a period of time of September and October 1941. There's over 100,000 deported from the eastern regions of Ukraine, as well as 50,000 in late August are taken out of Crimea into mostly what is then Ordzhonikidze Krai, or now Stavropol, and they will be deported in October to Kazakhstan as special settlers before being mobilized into the labor army to work mostly in the Urals. Not easy. I have interviewed one older ethnic German from Crimea who was deported to Kazakhstan after the initial removal to Ordzhonikidze, and then mobilized to work in Bakalstroy, ironworks in the Urals, the single largest labor army site that the Soviets established for ethnic German. But given what the attitude towards ethnic minorities, the Germans, I believe, were afraid of what happened with the Romanians. And the Romanian army comes into Ukraine, into Transnistria, which is an area just beyond Moldova. they go wild, looting and plundering and robbing the ethnic German villages because they're so much richer than the ones they've come across before. So this is like free loot to them. Of course, this does not make the Germans very happy. Heinrich Himmler puts all of the ethnic Germans in Romania directly under the protection of the SS. So we have the formation of Sondergruppe R, which I've talked about, which was the only SS division of Russlanddeutschen, in this case coming from the Black Sea region. Right? But the initial impetus for this was to protect those German communities from the Romanian ally. And Romania was an actual state, not just a terrorist organization like the OUN-B was. So I can understand why the Germans would be very reluctant to cooperate with people like Stetsko or Bandera when you had 300,000 German civilians still living in Ukraine. They would be primary targets for ethnic cleansing and genocide at the hands of the integral Ukrainian nationalists, just as the Polish population of Volhynia became in 1943 and 1944, where we have difficult to get exact numbers, but it looks like just in the height in July 43, 15,000 Polish civilians massacred by the military wing, the UPA, which was founded in 1942, Ukrainian Insurgent Army of the OUN-B, Organization Ukrainian Nationalist, the Bandera faction. So, in 1944, the Germans are already losing the war. They had already agreed in 1943, this was an initiative by Rosenberg, to kind of form an alliance of anti-communist Eastern Europeans, but it was largely on paper. But this is the beginning of the ABN, or Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, which will be initially supported by MI6 and then the CIA. But the fact that a lot of these guys, not just Ukrainians, people who were with the Ustashi in Croatia, other Eastern Europeans, too tainted by their association with the National Socialists and what happened in various parts of Eastern Europe during the Second World War. Things like Jasanovic, the concentration camp in the NDH, that they were basically abandoned as a liability in the 1960s, and funding is taken over, strangely enough, by East Asian governments through the World Anti-Communist League, particularly the Republic of China on Taiwan under Cheng Ching-kuo, and Republic of Korea, especially after Park Chung-hee becomes president. There's also some connections with the government of the Philippines and the Republic of Vietnam under Thieu and Ky. But obviously, the Philippines and South Vietnam very poor. Taiwan by the 60s and 70s becoming increasingly rich. Take a little bit longer for South Korea, but certainly compared to South Vietnam or the Philippines, even in the 1970s, doing better. But the ABN itself within WACL, largely dominated by the OUN-B under Yaroslav Stetsko, who was the person who declared himself premier of this Ukrainian government that the Germans arrest in 1941. And he will be basically the head of the ABN, and certainly the Ukrainian faction, which is the largest one politically, but also the largest in terms of any of the nation's populations, because Ukraine is much more populous than places like Croatia and Latvia and Bulgaria. But also Poland, because of the Volhynian massacres, refused to have anything to do with the ABN. None of the Polish emigre organizations would participate or cooperate with the ABN. So Poland, of course, has a considerably large population compared to places like Latvia and Bulgaria and Croatia, but again, the Poles are on the list of non-humans by the OUN-B. So They did not cooperate. And the OUN-B at this time, of course, focuses its opposition to the Russians, not so much the Soviets. It literally, as Russian, and Russian defined in a biological, racial sense as being Asians. And this will cause them trouble when they join WACO. They'll have to reconstruct that racialization of the Russians as being Asians because now their money is coming mostly from Taiwan. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. So I want to finish up here. So ABN roots go back to 43. In 44, of course, the Soviets now enter the part of Poland that they had annexed in 1940, this western part of Ukraine. And we see that the OUN-B now and the UPA, its armed wing, which had been engaged in this war against Polish civilians, now start to find itself having to fight against the Soviet NKVD. And they have a successful counterinsurgency strategy, but it is quite ruthless. Initially, it is largely the taking of relatives of the OUN members hostage, getting the relatives of OUN members to turn them over. I was shocked when I looked at the figures from the Ukrainian archives by Oblast. So the least successful, something like 1/3 of all the threatened families turned over OUN members that were their own family. But in the most successful, in Chernovice, it's like 98%. And it's over 50% in most of the regions, including places like Lviv. So this was successful. But then, of course, as time goes on, you get less and less people who will roll over as fast. The remaining people are more hardcore. And so we have the mass deportation of families of OUN members in order to deprive them of food and shelter. The big deportation started in October 1947 with about 78,000 family members of the organization Ukrainian Nationalists deported mostly into Siberia as special settlers. And this policy of deportations will continue on a large scale through 48, and then there'll be a little lull, but there'll be some more in the early 50s. So a few months before Stalin dies, there's almost 180,000 members of OUN, family members of the OUN registered as special settlers in the Soviet Union under the surveillance and jurisdiction of the section of special settlements under the MVD. The NKVD officially becomes the MVD in 1946, I believe. It's sometime after World War II. And this effectively, by draining the sea that the guerrillas swim in, just like the fish swim in water, ends the guerrilla insurgency, which is the largest of the guerrilla insurgencies in the western borderland of the Soviets fight. It makes sense. There's a lot more Ukrainians, obviously, than Estonians and Latvians, although there's quite a bit of armed resistance in Lithuania, which is not all that much larger than Latvia. Also, the deportations, larger number of absolute numbers of people from Western Ukraine and from the Baltic states. So think about 130,000 Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians deported in mostly 1948, Operation Vesna in Lithuania, and then 1949, Operation Priboi in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Whereas Ukraine, it's about 180,000 total. Operation Zapad, the big one. But the first large one is in October 1947. And this, of course, is still the time of the famine in parts of Ukraine. as well as other parts of the USSR as a result of damage from World War II and other factors. So 46, 47. About 1 million people in the USSR, including a number in Ukraine, die from hunger-related causes. So things are quite tough, but Soviets are persistent in their policies of hostage-taking, threats, and of course mass deportation of civilians who are related to UN members and UPA fighters, thereby depriving them of logistical support. And so really by the time Stalin's death, they've been completely crushed by 1953. So it's about 8 years, and the OUN-B and UPA successful at using guerrilla tactics as well as the asymmetrical tactics that they had used in Poland, that is, not so much fighting against the Red Army, but assassinating police and local government officials. This will also be in the Baltic states around the same time as well. These type of warfare, but they basically ends up with opposition to Soviet rule in Ukraine, while it remains strongest in the western parts of Ukraine, which had been under Austrian and Polish rule, and where the OUN-B and UPA had fought against the Soviets after World War II. The tactics really change, and the tactics show influence from the OUN-M, which had ventured off to try and organize in parts of Ukraine that had been under Soviet rule during the German occupation. So they are not geographically as concentrated as the OUN-B was, and they also are not engaging in the ethnic cleansing of Poles the way the OUN-B is in Volhynia and eastern Galicia. They also, even more so, influenced, I think, by more moderate, more cosmopolitan factors. So when you see the development of Ukrainian dissidents who are within Ukraine agitating for restoration of Ukrainian independence, a lot of them cooperate with people who are not ethnically Ukrainian, people who are Crimean Tatar, like Mustafa Shemiliev, people that are Jewish, like Ilya Gabe. A number of the dissidents are, in point of fact, former communists, most notably General Peter Grigorenko, who fought in the Soviet Red Army during the Second World War, so was certainly not on the side of the OUN-B or UPA. And we see also influence from other dissident movements in the Soviet Union as far as tactics. A lot of them developed by the Jewish emigration movement after 1967. We see a lot of influence from people who are Democrats rather than nationalists, many of them ethnic Russians, like Andrei Sakharov. So the 1976, when we have the foundation of the Ukrainian Helsinki Committee, and then later RUK, which will be the first party to come to power after independence in 1991, but I believe they are legalized as an operating political party in 1989. But these people are have a vision of Ukrainian nationalism that is much more civic and inclusive than the OUN-B, whose presence in Ukraine is annihilated in the western provinces, oblasti, by the NKVD, mostly using things like deporting all their family members to Siberia during the late 1940s and early 1950s. So where the OUN-B survives is in exile. And I said the ABN, particularly at the beginning, because some members of the 14th Waffen-SS Division Galician, which is Ukrainian Waffen-SS Division, are managed to escape to Italy and then are taken to Great Britain. MI6 cultivates them. And then later the CIA gets involved in it. They were interested in this initially because of guerrilla armed opposition to the communists within Europe. So you had in Ukraine and Lithuania particularly fighting against the Soviets. The UN and the UPA were also fighting against the Polish communists at the same time as the mass deportation eastward. There is mass deportations westward within Poland of the Lemkos Ukrainians in 1947, about 140,000 people dispersed to prevent them from having compact communities that could organize against the new Polish state, which, despite being communist, still had quite a few Polish national interests, one of which was preventing losing further territory in the southeast to the Ukrainians. And like as I mentioned on my Laotian lecture, a lot of these conflicts hide ethnic conflicts behind the veil of Marxism-Leninism. And we see, if you read the literature by Yaroslav Stetsko, in particular with ABN, when he talks about the Russians and the Soviet Union being a successor of the Russians, and the problem with the Russians being ethnic and racial rather than ideological, because they have a communist government. And then, of course, when the Soviet Union falls apart, Rook comes to power. The ABN is still around for a few years after the Soviet Union collapses. I believe it finally dissolved in 1996. After Yaroslav Stetsko himself died, his project, OUN-B, as it were, within the ABN, is taken over by his wife, Slava Stetsko. And she does form a political party in Ukraine in 1993. It was probably a mistake for the more moderate, more reasonable, willing to compromise nationalists that had formed in Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in the 1960s and 1970s and become Rook, but had, as I said, the roots in largely dissident movements coming out of the late 1960s and early 1970s, where there is a willingness to abide by the existence of ethnic minorities in an independent Ukraine, which is something that OUN-B never would have tolerated. And again, it's one of the reasons, you talk about the German government, well, why did it not take up the offer of 10 million Ukrainian soldiers by Yaroslav Stetsko and Stefan Bandera in 1941? Because they were worried that Bandera and Stetsko were going to kill all the Germans in Ukraine. They had enough trouble with the Romanian allies attacking the German settlements in Transnistria. The fact is, the opposite of a nationalist is another nationalist. They're not all allies. Greg Johnson smokes too much crack. So I can completely understand why Erich Koch, who greatly distrusted and hated the Ukrainians, easily won out on that fight against Alfred Rosenberg. All right. So that's about it for this presentation. To sum it up, Ukrainian nationalism It's anti-Polish and anti-Jewish. Anti-Jewish part doesn't come out much after World War II because of the Stetsko and others explained in the ABN after World War II, the Nazis had pretty much solved the JQ in Ukraine by shooting them in the Einsatzgruppen massacres in places like Babi Yar. So most of the Jews killed in Ukraine by the National Socialist occupation. Poland, between the Polish operation in 1937, 1938, where many tens of thousands of ethnic Poles in Ukraine are shot by the NKVD, and the mass deportations in 1940 out of eastern Poland, and the ethnic cleansing by the OUN-B and UPA during the Second World War of Poles in Volhynia and eastern Galicia, and finally a population exchange forcing many ethnic Poles, close to 800,000, that were in the Soviet claimed areas, areas that become annexed to Ukrainian Soviet Social Republic and Belarusian Soviet Social Republic, forcing them into the newly formed People's Republic of Poland in exchange for a number of Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Lithuanians to be sent to the Soviet side of the demarcation. So that problem was largely solved. German question, obviously, solved again by the Soviets. Starting in 1941, mass deportations from the eastern Ukraine, and then in 45, 46, those that were evacuated by the German military from central and western Ukraine being sent into Kazakhstan and Siberia as special settlers as well. And in the 1990s, most of the ethnic Germans from the Black Sea region being coming back to the land of their ancestors in Germany as Aussiedler, Spätaussiedler from Kazakhstan and Central Asia and Siberia. So that problem was solved. The only large ethnic minority left in Ukraine when it gets independence really are the ethnic Russians in the east and in Crimea, where along with many of the Ukrainians, they are fairly recent settlers. Germans removed, as I said, in August 41. Crimean Tatars deported in May of 1944 into Uzbekistan. And then in June of 1944, the Greeks, Bulgarians, and Armenians are forcibly deported out of Crimea by the NKVD. So Ukrainian Soviet Social Republic is largely Eastern Slavic after World War II, mostly Ukrainian with a sizable Russian minority. But this makes things much simpler for people of the ideology, the OUN-B. Now there's only one minority that needs to be removed. The Jews, the Germans, the Poles, the Crimean Tatars, the Greeks, the Bulgarians, the Armenians, these people are all gone for the most part, and there's only the ethnic Russians left. Although it does, I think, cause problems for white nationalists in the United States is that there's no way you can tell me there's a DNA difference between a Russian and Ukrainian. I'm not going to believe that. All right. So it's been 50 minutes. I'm going to let it go. I'm sure most people watching this probably disagree with me on a number of things, but I think I've been pretty balanced. I certainly can see why there was a strong anti-Soviet bent to the Ukrainian nationalism. You can even see why anti-Polish and anti-Jewish bent, but they are kind of one of the last integral nationalists left as far as this kind of extremist 1930s ideology was floating around some other places as well. Ustaše in Croatia, Iron Guard in Romania, Aerocross in Hungary, but was largely more extreme than German National Socialism. The German National Socialists never said that there would be no place in the new order of Europe for Frenchmen or Dutchmen or Norwegians or other Europeans, whereas the OUN-B and UPA from the very beginning targeting other Europeans, in this case, other Slavs. I should even be more specific, targeting other Slavs, specifically Polish, and then later Russians. All right, I will let this go, and we'll see how it is received.